The talk today is Richest reporting on the past, present, and future of Superfund in Butte. All right, who knows who that is that I'm talking to? Anyone? Mark Thompson. All right, great. So my name's Nora. I'm a reporter with Montana Public Radio based here in Butte. And I've been with MTPR since 2016. But I'm kind of a unicorn in the news department because while I've done some general assignment reporting and plenty of local stories, my job for the last year and a half has been to focus on making a new-ish, at this point, podcast project called Richest. So before we go any further, does everyone know what a podcast is or need a refresher? Well, we're going to do it anyway. All right, so the name is a hybrid of iPod and broadcast. And so iPods, were before smartphones, and you could just get these files on them, like listen to music. So podcasts contain digital files that you download or stream to listen to. I like to think of it kind of like an audiobook with different chapters. They come in lots of different formats. You might be familiar with some that are like talk shows or true crime or fiction. Ours is a single season, issue-focused, narrative nonfiction podcast. And we take inspiration from other radio shows like This American Life, Radio Lab, S-Town, you might be familiar with. All right, so Richest is a podcast about the past, present, and future of one of America's most notorious Superfund sites. I'm the reporter, the writer, and the host. We also have a producer, Nick Mott, and an editor, executive producer, Eric Whitney, who used to be with MTPR. He's now an NPR bureau chief. We also have a digital editor and producer, Josh Burnham, and that's our team. So right now, this is just available on the web, and I'll give you all the links later, but we do plan on airing it as a radio show and series when the project's complete. Okay, so this is interesting. The formatting, of course, got a little... actually, can we just zoom out a bit? Oh, shoot. Okay. That's all right. We'll go with it. It says, today we will. That's what you're missing. Okay. So today we're going to take a behind-the-scenes peek at the project, discuss a little bit about what goes into making a narrative nonfiction podcast, and listen to a few clips and the stories behind them. I'm not going to cover much like hard Superfund 101 or history or science content. I'm going to assume at this point you already have that. And also that's what we cover in the podcast. So if you need anything clarified as we go along, just speak up, raise your hand, let me know. All right. So why is Montana Public Radio making podcasts and investing in long-form audio storytelling and journalism? So a couple of reasons. The regular news format is quite limiting in the kinds of stories you can tell. With podcasts, you can be more experimental in terms of style and length and step outside the news box. And in our case, we're always trying to reach a new and younger audience. And we think our listeners are hungry for nuanced and in-depth storytelling. And frankly, so are our reporters. So our first real attempt in the MTPR news department at making a podcast was in 2017. With Subsurface, Resisting Montana's Underwater Invaders. I helped out on that, but Nikki Willett was the reporter on that one. And then the station was also a big supporter of Threshold, which is Amy Martin's brainchild. Season 1 explores the story of American bison. Season 2 is like a circumpolar journey around the Arctic, looking at what the Arctic is, how it's changing, and why that matters. And I did some editing on that as well. So as you can tell, these podcasts are very different in scope. But what they have in common is the chance to explore complex issues that are impossible to squash into a 2, 5, 7-minute news spot or feature. And they did pretty well. They both won some big awards and attracted some really great attention. Also have a lot of educational possibilities there that are being used in classrooms. So that's just a little background on MTPR and podcasts. So now, to be honest, when a lot of folks in Butte that I meet, outside of Butte, hear the word Superfund, they want to run the other way or their eyes glaze over. Maybe you've had this response too. So the logical question is, why and how, out of all the possible big stories in Montana, did MTPR choose to make a Butte Superfund journey as the focus of our next news podcast? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project's origins. But first of all, MTPR is a really small newsroom. We've never had a reporter based in Butte before. So we rely heavily on students in the journalism program at the University of Montana to help us cover stories that our reporting staff based in Missoula, the Flathead, and Helena just can't get to. So I had started grad school there at UM in 2016 in a program that focuses on environmental science and natural resource reporting. And I started working at MTPR at the same time. So Butte and Superfund came up a fair amount. It wasn't like there was radio silence about that. I learned, so I'm from Maryland originally. I learned that Butte had been a copper mining superpower, and more recently, for the last 30 years, Butte had become the epicenter of the largest complex of Superfund sites in the country. But I never heard much about, public involvement or any recent action going on in the community. So a lot of what I did here in Missoula was that Butte had accepted its fate as a Superfund site and the toxic price of the mining windfall, and was more or less apathetic. Honestly, the stories you hear are that Superfund and Butte, stagnant. And it kind of felt like everyone knew the whole story already and how it was going to end. But being from Montana, I did not. So thanks to Montana Public Radio, kind of as a shortcut to not having someone in Butte, I started doing some interviews with David McCumber, who's the editor of the Montana Standard. I don't think he's here right now. Okay. That was kind of a crash course in Superfund history and developments, and honestly the real beginning of my nerdy obsession with all things Butte and Superfund. McCumber is quite invested in these issues, and it started to rub off on me. So I also started to do some of my own radio reporting out of Butte. I went to an event called Hope for Snow Geese, which was a Butte-style wake for thousands of birds that died in the Berkeley pit in November 2016. And the more time I spent in Butte, the more I got to know people here, and I soon began to encounter a narrative that went against the grain of everything I had heard in Missoula or elsewhere. So to me, it seemed like a lot was happening. EPA was starting doing health studies. There was a new pilot project to pump and treat Berkeley pit water. Dirt was starting to fly on the removal of the Parrott tailings. And some community activists were raising hell about cleaning up the headwaters of Silverbow Creek. So it seemed like a lot of momentum was building to keep moving forward with the Superfund cleanup. And I started to get curious about, why was Butte seemingly further behind than Milltown Dam or Silverbow Creek or parts of the Clark Fork River? So a couple of you were in the room when I gave my defense last year. This slide might look familiar. I ended up doing a half-hour radio documentary called The Last First Mile about Butte's fight to restore the first mile of historic Silverbow Creek, and that aired on MTPR last May. This is, Upper Silverbow Creek, Metro Storm Drain, whatever you want to call it. My goal with this project was to humanize one community's attempt to kind of wedge their way into an often very opaque, technocratic, federal hazardous waste cleanup program that's been a part of the reality here for decades and that does not easily make space for the public. So from the beginning, I looked at this project as kind of a longer-term investment in building a foundation of knowledge around Superfund and relationships in Butte, and not just like a one-and-done thing. And it was, because my experience reporting and producing this really planted the seeds that blossomed into Richest Hill. Because at the same time that there appeared to be this uptick in grassroots environmental activism in Butte, something kind of surprising happened. Not long after President Trump got elected, the new administration he put in place an Environmental Protection Agency named Superfund one of its top priorities. And out of more than 1,300 Superfund sites across the country, they handpicked Butte and Anaconda and targeted them for immediate and intense attention. A lot of EPA's language around this had to do with expediting and finishing cleanups that have been languishing. So as the result of EPA's new agenda, the new regional administrator, Doug Benevento, started spending a lot more time in Butte and pressuring the parties in charge of the cleanup to get to a final financial deal consent decree that's legally binding, which had been underway and under wraps for about 13 years. So since it's legally binding and has a lot of money behind it, this deal is going to have some big impacts on the land, water, and the community here. So it was clear that after a period of stagnation in Butte, things were starting to happen fast. And here on the ground, there was some cautious optimism about what this all might mean, no matter who was at the top, whether you support the agenda or not. But from 10,000 feet, it looked a little bit like President Trump's EPA was maybe trying to make Butte an example of how it takes action on environmental protection, not just environmental deregulation. And so, they're making this claim like, we're going to try to solve this problem no one else has been able to. We're going to try to clean up Butte. This is a very busy slide. Okay, I started to fall in love with Butte pretty early on. Y'all know why. So when EPA started to turn the screw, I found myself wondering, with a healthy amount of journalistic skepticism, about whether this is really about cleaning up Butte, or is it trying to sweep the mess under the rug, or trying to take credit for something? We don't know. So that led to more questions like, why is Butte the epicenter of one of the biggest, most complex, most notorious Superfund sites in the country? How'd we get here? What does clean really mean in this day and age? What comes after Superfund, and who gets to decide that? So it looked to me like this was a critical juncture in the cleanup, and what happens this year and with this deal will significantly influence Butte's environment and economy in the near future and the long term. Oh, this is rough, man. Okay. So it says, Shaping the Podcast Dough, NPR Story Lab, May 2018. Along with those different ingredients we just talked about and Butte's rich history and incredible people who live here, MTPR started to think like, this story is not just about Butte, it's not just about Montana, it's something people across the country could connect with. And we weren't wrong, because we pitched the idea to NPR's Story Lab workshop, which is an experimental audio project incubator. And our team got in, and we spent a week shaping the dough, this podcast, with experts in the field at the mothership in DC. And we came back from this workshop with a roadmap for this project. And so our conceit all along has been that none of us have a crystal ball, so we don't know how this story ends yet, whether or not this deal is going to go through, what might be in it. But our plan was to tell the story in chapters and just keep reporting on the developments as they unfold in real time. So in quite a short amount of time, MTPR went from, maybe we'll do our next podcast about this, to, well, let's start it, see if we can raise some funds for it, to, I'm moving to Butte, we're doing this come hell or high water. So since last June, I've been living in Butte, used to be right below the original mine there, and embedded, as we say, here, and making Richest Hill. I just live here. My address is Butte. That's all you need to know. This is some personal protective equipment I've come to enjoy wearing. We knew early on that in order to appreciate what Butte's going through right now, we had to trace the social, environmental, and political roots of the situation and explore some select threads in Butte's rich history. So to get the project off the ground, we threw a local launch party last year, I think some of you were at. We tried to get some input from the community, got some really great ideas about what rabbit holes to fall into. And then we got started, and we released our first episode in March. Okay. Everyone can still hear me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. All right. So episode 1 is called Butte's Precarious Arrangement. And it's kind of an extended preview to get listeners kind of intrigued by Butte and how weird and wonderful it is here, with a potpourri of local voices and some who will become people we'll hear more from later on. So we touch a little bit on how Butte was at one time the state's economic and political powerhouse because of one thing, copper. And that people here will tell you Butte's Mountain of Metal made Montana, and that the richest hill on earth literally electrified the nation and made the brass and the bullets that won both world wars. This may sound familiar. We also mentioned the flip side of that, which is that mining left a big mess, and Butte's the epicenter of one of the biggest Superfund sites in the country. And now, Butte is on this verge of a final Superfund deal that President Trump's EPA promises will clean up mining, the mining city once and for all, by 2024. And we tease the questions that we're going to try to answer in the rest of the series. Okay, so I'm just kind of giving an overview of each episode so far, and then we'll talk about some challenges and some successes. So episode 2, for the benefit of mankind, we take a closer look at the copper that put the Richest Hill on the map, some of the city's storied past, the nostalgia and sense of purpose that pervades the mining city. So we start out at the Berkeley Pit with Mark Mariano and the waterfowl mitigation program. And here, what first appears to be a toxic pit also becomes a bewildering source of life. And that's kind of a theme running through our series, and that's very important to me, which is that if you look closely at Butte, things will surprise and change you if you let them. Because I think it's really easy to walk away with first impressions here, and those may not be true. So then we spend some time with local historian Dick Gibson, who helps us understand that at its peak, Butte produced 1/3 to 1/4 of the world's copper, and where it all came from. And then we meet some old school underground miners like Al Beavis on the right there. He's sitting at the coffee shop with Fritz Daly, and Louis Luchine and Larry Hoffman. And to understand what kind of labor and effort it took to get all this copper out of the ground. And then we start to wonder, well, who's getting rich off all this not quite precious metal? It's probably not the miners. So episode 3 is called First and Last Warning. In it, we explore the David versus Goliath struggle between working people and the handful of men and then one company that called the shots on the Richest Hill. And because the things that happened here a century ago laid the groundwork for who's on the hook for Butte Superfund cleanup today. This is why we're doing such a deep dive in history. So we encounter IWW wobbly activist Frank Little through the eyes of labor union members who still celebrate him and his quest to unify and radicalize Butte's miners in their fight against the Anaconda Mining Company for higher wages and safer working conditions. We meet the owner of the Copper King Mansion in Butte to learn about William Clark, and then turn to the rise of Marcus Daly's Anaconda Company. And we ponder the question, were Butte's Copper Kings visionary entrepreneurs? Were they cutthroat capitalists? Maybe both and. And we get a feel for Butte's heady glory days around the turn of the century, World War I, also with Dick Gibson, and also the toll the production frenzy took on miners. So we look at Butte's trajectory from being the Gibraltar of labor unions to the site of major unrest, and how Anaconda solved its labor problems domestically, and then set their sights on an even bigger pot of red gold on a different continent. So episode 4 is called We Gave It to the Pit. In this one, we get a little bit curious about the contradictions and compromises that go hand in glove with industrialization. And we wonder, who thought chiseling this big hole in the earth was a good idea and why? There must have been some pretty good reasons. So in this episode, we take a figurative dive into open pit mining and some controversial decisions that made late last century that changed Butte's land, people, and environment forever. So we talked to Professor Brian Leach about some of the conditions that caused the Anaconda Company to pivot to open pit mining, some of the trade-offs that came with that for the workers themselves, but also for people who lived in the neighborhoods that were destroyed during the expansion of the Berkeley Pit. Like, this is Tom Holter, who was an underground and open pit miner, and he grew up in Meterville, which was kind of Butte's Little Italy. And this was what was there in the 1950s before the pit was dug, kind of on the east side of Butte. And this is a famous picture from Walter Hinnick with some rubble burying the Holy Savior Church. And there's the Berkeley Pit flooded, not when it was being mined. Then we talked to author and academic Janet Finn, who traced the veins of copper mining and capitalism across the world, from Butte to Chuquicamata, Chile. And we learned how the Anaconda Company became one of the biggest copper mining companies on the planet. And they vertically and horizontally integrated their operations. And they were able to then kind of play their two big copper camps and ore bodies off each other, basically to make money and exploit the resources, which is pretty much what they were there to do. But they were able to do that up until a point. And that was when under Salvador Allende, Chile nationalized its mines and sent the Anaconda Company into a death spiral. I don't want to say Allende did that. Losing that sent them into a death spiral. So we end this chapter by hearing from Frank Gardner about why an oil company named Atlantic Richfield would possibly want to buy a mining company. And then some of the factors that led to their decisions to eventually shut down all mining operations in Montana in the early 80s. And as former Congressman Pat Williams says, then all of a sudden the party ended, and there's the Mater D standing at the door with the bill. All right, so this is episode 5, and this is the last one we've released so far. It's called Out of the Frying Pan into the Fire. And so we examine how Butte's mining industry made Montana great, electrified America. The boom also left an environmental bust, one very big, that it didn't just leave open wounds on the hill. You know, it turned an entire river into an industrial sacrifice zone. We'll talk about language a little bit later. But anyways, in this chapter, we take a look at the dawning of the Superfund era in Montana and the origins of the government program designed to force whoever made this mess to clean it up, or whoever inherited the mess to clean it up. So we meet Deer Lodge resident and conservationist Kathy Hadley, who has a personal connection to the Love Canal disaster in New York, which was something that kicked off or was influential in getting CERCLA passed. And then she and her family moved to Montana thinking that was behind them, and only to discover they'd gone from the first Superfund site to essentially the biggest, which is why her husband Wayne Hadley says, out of the frying pan into the fire. And so then we spend some time on the Clark Fork River with some folks from the Clark Fork Coalition, who are all about cleaning up the river. And we wanted to see up close how this force of Mother Nature basically distributed tailings from Butte throughout an entire watershed, and how far Butte's mining legacy reaches, for better or for worse. And so we traveled down the river. So that's Kathy. This is some slick-ins on one section of the Clark Fork River. That's us standing in the back there. And then this is Peter Nielsen at Milltown State Park, kind of overlooking where Milltown Dam used to be and where the two rivers, where the confluence is. So we go down there to understand, why did the Superfund cleanup start 120 miles downstream from Butte with tainted tap water at an old hydroelectric dam instead of, here at the source of the historic pollution. So we're working on episode 6 currently, and it's tentatively named Our Most Cherished Beliefs. That's from Edwin Dobb. He's going to be in here. Anything I tell you about this episode may turn out not to be true, depending on what the editors decide. But anyways, remember how at the beginning of this series we told you Butte's on the verge of this final deal that's going to clean up the mining city once and for all? That deal is being sealed as we speak, which is why Nakia can't come next week, right? So to understand what's in it and why it matters, we have to know the backstory of what really happened when Superfund did arrive in Butte. And we are asking, who are the players? What was the game? So I don't want to give too much more, but suffice to say there are some heavy hitters in this episode. And we're going to look at Superfund through the lens of a poker game to understand what's at stake. So up there is Eric Hassler and John Sesso from Butte, Silver Boat County. We have Mary Kay Craig, who's a longtime community activist. She's holding a Get Well Soon Berkeley Pit card from the 90s. We have Sandy Stash, who was very influential in Atlantic Richfield at this time, did a lot of PR work in this watershed. Sarah Sparks there in front of her house. She was the project manager of the Butte Hill prior to Nakia Green. And then up top here, who went to the Cool Water Hula, first or second one? Beautiful. Okay, great. So Cool Water Hula that Christy Hager organized, kind of an interesting community response to part of the Superfund issue and cleanup. So we'll talk about that. I'm just going to do a time check here. All right. So honestly, this last episode has been the hardest for me so far, because there are thousands of pages of technical documents from EPA and others. There's a lot less written in story form about the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s that I could find. And I think that's for obvious reasons, because it's not as much fun to write about economic depression and struggle and hardship as it is to write about the Copper Kings or Frank Little or the Gibraltar of Labor or Butte's heyday. But I don't think that means that this recent era is less important. It may be more important. Anyways, that just means I spent more time digging through archives, reading newspaper stories, hanging out at the Superfund library, and talking mostly to a lot of people. And so I'm really looking forward to this episode and the ones to come after, because they're more in the present. I was here from some of it. I feel like I have a little bit more of authority on it. All right, so where's this story going? And isn't this a beautiful picture? Thank you, Norm, for sending this to me. So we're planning about 10 episodes total. We're hoping to wrap up this project by late spring or early summer of next year. In terms of what's coming up next, we're planning on exploring what hasn't happened during the Superfund era in the last 32 years. When the deal comes out, we're going to take a closer look at it. What's in it? What does this mean? What is it promising to do? What the reactions and responses to it are. Then, to give some broader context to this whole thing in Butte, we're going to try to zoom out and report on how Superfund has evolved under various presidential administrations, and how what's happening under President Trump and the current EPA is either similar or different, trying to locate what's happening in Butte right now in a much larger story. We also plan on taking a look at what could be around the corner for Butte, various visions, if and when Superfund is in the rearview mirror, and also where the active open pit mining industry fits into this picture. And hopefully, we're going to end on some deeper philosophical reflections about this idea of healing a broken environment to begin with, and what we have and haven't learned about living within our own and the planet's means. Okay, so that was a crash course in what we've done so far. So I want to really be honest about some challenges with this project. And I have to scoot right after this is over, but I welcome you, I encourage you to take me up on any one of these at any point. So there are some real challenges in making this kind of narrative nonfiction podcast. I know podcasts are really popular. You probably want to make one, right? But not to be a bummer, be careful what you wish for, because it is a lot of work. Our team is small. That's Nick, myself, and Eric. We're missing Josh here, our digital guy. As I said, I'm the reporter, the writer, and the host. I think that's too many roles. What that just means is it takes a lot of time to produce each episode. Sometimes months, and this could be hurting our ability to retain our audience, because in podcasting it's all about consistency, right? You expect that episode to drop every Friday because you listen on the media, so that's one thing. There's a lot of competition out there for time and attention. We're aware of that. Second, we framed this whole project around whether or not Butte might get this final consent decree. And that means we're working on EPA's timelines, not ours. And that was a pretty big gamble to begin with. And it's also a heavy lift to balance, trying to continue to move forward with this project while still reporting local news stories. They are interdependent. It does mean if and when the consent decree becomes public, we might have to put a pause on this for a couple weeks just to cover what's actually happening. So as we kind of discussed, the first half of this project has been trying to bring relevant aspects of Butte's history and Superfund to life and still have it resonate with people in the present day. And that's kind of hard to come up with, well, what kind of action and scene and memorable characters, which all make good radio, how do we do that? And how do we get that tape? So that's what I'm constantly thinking about. And so one example, what I'm talking about is we could read about Frank Little, or thankfully someone invited me to his memorial tribute, and there were people singing about him and reading some of his manifesto, and that's so much more powerful, So that's one thing. Superfund in general, as a subject of inquiry, even for those of you in the room who work on it, you probably, I'm wondering if you would agree that it's very technical and bureaucratic and complicated and can be a little bit impenetrable. So that's just an inherent challenge, And then this thing of being, informative and entertaining versus comprehensive. As a reporter, my instinct is to try to turn over every rock and find what worms are under there. But I have to keep the listener in mind and remember that, people respond to people doing things that they care about. And you can, most listeners can only tolerate so much science or numbers or jargon, which Superfund has plenty of. Also, this is not an investigative journalism project. It's very tempting to go down some of those roads. That might be fodder for the future. That is not what Richest Hill is about. But it gets a little confusing sometimes. So on that note, what does that say? I don't know, background reporting and something. On that note, we can only feature so many people and so many voices in each episode without it becoming really overwhelming to your ears and to your brain. So I spend a lot of time doing research, conducting background interviews, attending meetings and events, trying to listen and absorb information, but also try to sort out who might be the right person to represent a broad perspective or a broad experience, knowing that there's 35,000 people who live here and everyone has a valid experience and point of view. That becomes more delicate because I live here, and so this is a pretty small, tight-knit town. And so on the one hand, the pro is that I have great access to people. Folks here have been extremely generous and kind with their time and thoughts. I'm here, I'm soaking up things as they're happening, and I can speak to that from a real place. On the other hand, I also have to navigate building relationships, being part of the community, and keeping professional boundaries with sources and folks and subjects I might be reporting on in the future. So that's kind of interesting. And I just want to be really clear that the purpose of this project is never to point fingers at an individual or lay blame or throw anyone under the bus. It's about teasing out these larger dynamics, themes, trends, the realities of being a mining town in a Superfund community, and the things that make Butte so complex and fascinating and unique. So I think, because there can be sometimes a small number of people involved, there's a lot of hearsay about stuff, but that's not what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to get at the bigger picture here. So another challenge is the audience. We all live here, and I'm aware of some of the nuances and priorities of folks, of the government here. And it can be a little challenging to try to keep the faith with Butte and also serve our nationwide audience. So it's been pointed out to me that we use language like toxic mess or ecological sacrifice zone a lot. And if you live here, as we do, that can get really old and feel insensitive and potentially harmful. And I am aware of that. At the same time, we're trying to convey, certain realities to someone who might never have been here, and we want them to keep listening and not get bored. So that's a challenge because, again, our audience is nationwide. So I understand there are some folks probably here who would rather MTPR focus our reporting energies on anything but Superfund and the stigma and the label, and I can really empathize with that. I'm also a firm believer of what Leonard Cohen says, which is, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Or if you prefer, the Washington Post, democracy dies in darkness. So I think it's really important not to turn away from this and lean in and dig deeper and try to get out, multiple things going on. Additionally, I'm the writer, but I have kind of two editors, and sometimes they might encourage us to use phrasing or language that I might not use if I'm having a drink with you at the bar, because I know it's going to piss you off. So I was going to play a clip, but we'll get to the last clip. But one example just came up is that in our first episode, we make a statement: when birds land on the Berkeley pit, they die. This really frustrated someone who knows a lot about the subject. And I could totally understand why, because on the one hand, that's not true. lots of birds land on the Berkeley pit and they live, especially now that MR is running an amazing waterfowl mitigation program, right? At the same time, a lot of birds have died on the Berkeley pit, and we sandwich that with talking about the geese incidents in '95 and 2016. So we're trying to both like create a spectacle and then also debunk and alter the impressions you might get about Butte. And because this is an episodic series, we can do that. Whereas in one story, we couldn't really. So like, we'll tell you something in episode 1, episode 2, you're hanging out with Mark Mariano at the Berkeley pit, understanding that like, there's a lot of incredible stuff going on here. So that was one thing. And then the last thing I really want to touch on is down here, ownership and permission to tell Butte's story. Someone at a journalism ethics panel recently asked me how I got permission to tell Butte's story, and I really hope she was baiting me, because I do not feel like I have permission to tell Butte's story. I'm an outsider as a transplant and as a journalist, and I probably always will be. But that gives me a little bit of buffer too, to kind of look at things with a bit of distance. And so the more I learn about what Butte's been through, the more empathy I have towards people who feel protective over the story. And there's also legitimately a long time when the Anaconda Company also owned the presses here, right? And so there's a long history of Butte's story being taken or co-opted or not being told in the voices from the people who live here. And so I realize we have a big platform and a privilege. And I feel like our job is to help kind of elevate different voices, different perspectives, the many truths that exist here. Whether you're an underground miner, environmental activist, an agency staffer, or someone who really doesn't give anything about Superfund, right? So we also have editorial power, and we're aware of that. And so we're always trying to exercise thoughtfulness and responsibility around that. And if you have suggestions how to improve, we're always open to that. So last challenge, I said that was going to be the last. This is quite an expensive project to make, and it's really hard to quantify the value to Montana Public Radio or to our audience. And so that being said, I think we're doing all right.
The thing is, the Berkeley pit is really popular.
No! How do I turn this off? Stop. Okay. All right. So, so we were talking about successes. So we got spontaneously reviewed in the New Yorker. That was pretty exciting online, nonetheless, still the New Yorker. We got featured on NPR One, which was a big boost. So, with podcasts, the big thing is like, how many downloads, how many listens? So we're close to 500,000 downloads now, which is pretty big considering there's about 1 million people in Montana and like 76,000 listeners of Montana Public Radio. So that's a lot, which means that it's not just people in Montana listening. We got sponsorship from Sierra Nevada. And then we've just gotten some really interesting feedback, both from people who don't know anything about Butte but feel like they connect with the story, or people from here who have struggled to communicate, how about their hometown to a stranger. We also have some pretty high up federal agency staff listening, which to me is quite affirming and also scary. Most of the feedback we've gotten so far has been positive. We welcome constructive criticism. We read and listen to each and every comment, so don't hold back. And then just a couple of flourishing touches I just want to mention, like being place-based and part of the community is really important to me. Our logo was designed by BT Livermore, who's a wonderful local artist based at the Imagine Butte Resource Center. Our theme music was from Doubling Gulch. Thank you to Clark for helping record them. We also have some music in the episodes that you might be like, wait, is that the Steward Mine bell? And it is, because I sent a bunch of found sounds from industrial stuff in Butte and just hanging out to these two musicians, and they came back with some experimental ambient electronic music to help with our sound design. And if you have other ideas, that would be great. So I was just going to play my favorite clip, which is it's about 6 minutes long, so we should be just at the end here. This is the intro to episode 5. We're going to hear a little bit about Raylan Brandel's experience growing up here in Butte. She's standing in front of one of her favorite trees down near Silver Road Creek. So, hold on.
You know how sometimes...
Yeah, that was it. Hold on. How do we... There's like an embedded clip in here. Yeah, you can just do that.
You know how sometimes you meet someone and you're like, I want to be more like her when I grow up? For me, that person is currently Raylan Brandel. She's 47, but doesn't look it. She's an environmental educator, rides a motorcycle, and she's a boxer. Just won her second match. Raylan is a fourth-generation Butte girl. Her general badassery, I believe its roots can be traced to her growing up here in the 70s and 80s, under the influence of an infamous local hero.
Okay, well, I am not supposed to be afraid.
At 2 p.m., he began the jump that would make him a legend.
Eagle's ready, the amazing study cycle. That gyro power sends him over 100 feet at top speed.
He survived with only a broken nose. Not bad for a daredevil who had broken over 40 bones in his lifetime.
Yes, it was all about being evil Knievel at that age.
Evil Knievel.
So she and her friends would zoom around on their proto-BMX bikes, trying to conquer the heaps of loose, flowing golden material scattered everywhere on the Butte Hill. Especially this one at the very top of it, the Alice Knob. We went to check it out one day last winter.
So this knob was like a plateau, flat on top, and then very steep-sided all the way around. It was like an octagon, I guess, in a way, but it was really weird shape, and it's super fun, so you just try to run as fast as you could up it with your bike or a motorbike. When we got to be a little bit older, you try to do the telemarking with a motorbike. And we'd come from Daly Street and just, straight up as fast as we could.
Today, the Alice looks pretty tame. It's been graded, covered with soil, and seeded with grass. But in Raylan's day, it loomed over the hamlet of Walkerville, beckoning would-be daredevils.
It was like a rite of passage in a way. Like if you could make the top, then cheer, put your arms in the air. Like I did
For a
it.
lot of you kids, it was very fun.
Heck yeah! Yeah, you play out here, and then fireworks. You light your fireworks out here, all that. And nobody cared because you couldn't wreck it.
You couldn't wreck it because the Alice Knob and other piles just like it all over town are old mine dumps, the barren leftovers of a century of mining. Butte, the mountain made of metal, no doubt had a bounty of gold, silver, and copper, of course, but the metals weren't pure like shiny pennies used to be. They were sulfide minerals, bound up with things like lead, arsenic, zinc, iron, sulfur, all of which had to be somehow cleaved from the good stuff. So khaki-colored mounds of waste rock and tailings were just left behind, destined to become the favorite stomping grounds of Raylan and generations of Butte kids before her. Did you know what you were playing on?
It was just dirt. I always thought dirt looked like this ore body waste that we pull up. I didn't know that dirt was brown and loamy and smelled good and you could grow things in it. I just thought it was like that.
We drive down to the bottom of the hill to check out another old haunt, a fallow field known as the Diggings, where she would play archaeologist and unearth all sorts of buried treasure, like animal bones stained blue from all the copper in the ground.
My dad's like, that's there because it was a dump, right? Oh. And then we talk about these layers, because some of them would be this really bright yellow color, some of them would be greenish, and then we called it clay, but now I know it's tailings. And it would be firm, and you could pack it really firm,
And you're touching all this with bare hands.
Yeah, of course.
The Diggings hasn't changed much in 40 years. The big tree that was home base in games of tag is still there, and so are the bike jumps they built out of mine waste back in the day. Did you or your friends think this was a problem at all?
No, other than, we had some pretty epic wrecks out here. Some of these jumps are huge, so it was, there was broken arms and concussions and things like that, but it wasn't about, we're gonna die from this. There was never any fear of that. other than death by impact or something.
Right, not exposure.
Not exposure.
But her carefree days of youth were shorter than most. Raylyn was a tween in the early 80s when Atlantic Richfield abandoned Butte's mines and the economy hit rock bottom.
Our class always seemed to be the class that everything was closing down. Schools were getting closed, or we lost a business, or families were moving. And I guess I can describe it as a feeling, like it just, like my stomach would hurt. And I don't know if it was that I was picking up the anxiety of the adults or my friends or whatever, but I was worried a lot. I felt worried.
Now, it's pretty normal for kids to complain about their hometown and say, there's nothing to do here. I know I certainly did. But Raylyn says the difference back then was
That our parents were saying, to get a job, to be employed, you're going to have to go to college and get out of here. I mean, they felt urgent about it.
the mining city appeared to be dying a slow, painful death. Then one morning, it felt like the last nail was being hammered in Butte's coffin. It was 1987. Raylyn was in her dad's truck.
I remember all these details, so I think that it's because it hurt.
He was giving her a ride to Butte High School, like he did every day.
My father and I were just driving right here on Caw, and we were heading kind of north, and it was on the radio about this is after the closure of the mine. It was on the radio, we were listening to a radio show about Butte being declared a Superfund site.
Her dad got very quiet and listened carefully.
Finally, the story kind of gets over, and he's like, well, I don't know how that's going to go. And I asked him, I go, what's a Superfund? What does that mean? And he said, well, my dad was great. He always looked things up or got more information. He goes, well, I got to understand it more. He goes, but it sounds like we're being declared an environmental disaster.
I'm Nora Sachs. Welcome to Richest, a podcast about the past, present, and future of one of America's most notorious Superfund sites, from Montana Public Radio.
So I really like that because I just feel like, for me, Raylyn really brought to life some of the anxiety of that time, and also like the fun and joy of growing up here, and also just like the not knowing what this meant. And so that's the thread that we kind of pick up in this next episode. I'm happy. I know that some of y'all might need to run. I'm happy to stick around and answer some questions. I just want to say thank you all for coming, for listening, for your support, for your time. We couldn't do this without you. The formatting's killing me. Anyways, feel free to, give me a holler. It's my personal contact information. You can listen to any of the episodes at buttepodcast.org or on, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter at Butte Podcast. I've got a couple cards up here with my contact and also some stickers if you would like one. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yeah.